And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. It is Wednesday, July 10th, and this outlook will be for Thursday and Friday. First, we check the state of the sea ice, and in the far north we find open water here throughout much of the lower Chukchi Sea, openings also off of Point Lay and west of Wainwright. And at least the ice gradually melting here along areas of the Arctic coast, though temperatures have trended cooler than normal here across the Bering Strait and Chukchi Sea. But again, as we go through midsummer, we'll just continue to experience this gradual melt off, even though temperatures are expected to average below normal here through mid-month. And looking at what we expect for the weather map here, late tonight, early on Thursday morning, weak low pressure south of Kodiak Island. This feature drifting northeastward and weakening. Of more importance is we have a system, colder air aloft, a little more unstable here across the northern Bering. It's going to link up with this moisture and piece of energy riding along the central Aleutians. And by the time we get into Thursday afternoon, we can see this system here is going to become the dominant low that ends up moving into the Gulf this weekend. But meanwhile, as these two systems do have a link, it's going to push another round of steadier rain across southwest portions of the state late Thursday night and Friday. Rainfall amounts half to an inch, with locally upwards of 2 inches where you have favorable southeast flow being enhanced by the terrain. So there could be some locally heavier rainfall in areas of the southwest along and inland from Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay, as well as northern parts of the Alaska Peninsula. But by the time we get into Friday, this low is going to become the main low, and that's going to work its way up into the western Gulf with some gale force winds by Saturday, entrance of Cook Inlet, especially here along the northern Gulf outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. There will likely be some gale force winds on Saturday. And also some pretty good moderate to even locally heavy rains across areas of the Gulf Coast, and that's going to spread up into south central and then eventually in through the central eastern interior by Sunday and into early next week. So this overall cooler and wet pattern will continue. Looking at the marine forecast on Thursday, south-southeast winds 15 knots for the inner channels here of the Panhandle with waves 2-3 feet. For the outer nearshore waters, winds will be southerly 20 to 25 knots south of Sitka with swells 6 feet. And then look for southeast to east winds 25 to 30 knots there outside of Gustavus and outside of Yakutat Bay. For Friday, kind of a mix of winds. Southeast winds there, Stevens Passage 15 knots, southerly winds to 15 knots within Lynn Canal, waves 2-3 feet there, and then northwest winds 15 knots with 3-foot waves down toward Dixon Entrance. Winds will be south-southwest around 10 knots south of Sitka off of Craig, swells 4-5 feet, and then southeast winds 15 to 20 knots with swells of 5 to 6 feet, especially as you get further out toward Cape Suckling. And then for Thursday, outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, look for easterly winds 25 to 30 knots, northeasterly off the Kenai coast, swells 6-7 feet. Within Prince William Sound, easterly winds 15 knots, waves 2-3 feet. And then as we go down upper middle Cook Inlet, look for northeast to north winds 10 to 15 knots, swells 2 to maybe 3 feet. Winds are going to start to pick up, though, Friday in advance of that system. Easterly winds to 30 knots with swells 8 to 9 feet here at the entrance of Cook Inlet. As we go up the inlet, northeast winds 15 knots, swells 3-4 feet. Easterly winds within Prince William Sound on Friday at 15 knots with 2-foot waves. And we expect even stronger gale force winds within this region outside of Hinchinbrook entrance on Saturday for sure, and probably approaching that for the entrance of Cook Inlet on Saturday. Northeast winds around 20 knots. Thursday, they're around Kodiak Island, variable across the middle peninsula at 15 knots, but picking up southeasterly 20 to 25 knots with some gusts to 40 knots, especially there north of Cold Bay. Swells generally 3 to 4 feet. And then on Friday, as we see the system beginning to get organized, the secondary low as it begins to track northeastward, look for northeast winds 25 knots within Shellicroft Strait with 8-foot waves. Circulation southeast 30 knots, Bristol Bay off of Chicknick. And then on the backside of the low, winds whipping around to the west as high as 30 knots there south of False Pass, swells 5 to 6 feet on the Pacific side. For the eastern Aleutians, winds will generally be out of the southeast, 25 to 30 knots on Thursday, switching back over though to the southwest, 20 to 25 knots, even a bit upwards of 30 knots from the southwest there just to the west of Adak. And on Friday, we expect northwesterly winds 20 to 25 knots across the eastern half of the Aleutians, north to northeast winds Atka, Adak, westward, and then finally easterly winds there, Kiska to Shemya at 20 knots for Friday. Across the southwest coast, look for southeast winds 15 knots into Bristol Bay, south winds into Kuskokwim Bay, southeast winds 15 knots around the Pribilov Islands, southerly winds to 20 knots along the Yukon Delta, and southeast winds within this wider expanse of Norton Sound to 20 knots for Thursday. And then on Friday, with the two lows, the one taking shape here and the other one sitting off here, we expect easterly winds out of Norton Sound 25 knots, 15 to 20 knots along the lower Yukon Delta. 25 knot easterly winds out of Kuskokwim Bay, 30 knot southeast winds into Bristol Bay, and then on the backside, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots from St. Matthew down through St. Paul. And around the Bering Strait, winds will generally be out of the east-southeast 15 knots up into the lower Chukchi Sea with swells a few feet. Easterly flow 15 knots north of Cape Lisburn on up to Utqiagvik, and those easterly winds at 15 knots continue all the way back toward Kaktovik. On Friday, along the far north Arctic coast, east-northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, maybe a bump there to 20 knots southwest of Utqiagvik off of Wainwright, and then kind of a mixed bag of winds dropping down through the lower Chukchi Sea, though generally northeasterly 15 knots with swells of a couple of feet. And then south of the Bering Strait along the east or west side of the Seward Peninsula and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, look for east to northeast winds right around 20 knots.